Here are the top 5 decks for you guys to play in Clash Royale right now. With the global tournament starting up in a few days, there are so many new decks that have been popping up recently, so without further ado, let's get right into them. Number 1. Lava Hound, Skeleton King. Finally, after so long, we have a brand new variation of Lava Hound. That being said, it still retains the very easy offensive plan that most Lava Hound decks have. So starting off the match, I'm always going to be very aggressive, either just playing the Lava Hound in the back at the beginning or responding to my opponent's plays with a Lava Hound in the back. The reason for this is because the Lava Hound is just so tanky, and since the opponents are going to have to spend so much elixir defending the Lava Hound, it's gonna really prevent your opponents from getting that much of an offensive counter push. In terms of supporting the Lava Hound, it's also very simple. I generally will only recommend supporting the Lava Hound with one of your support units and then a miner in as well. This is in order to prevent your opponents from getting too much spell value because the units in this deck are not the most tanky. Finally, the Skeleton King is also very effective on offense as it serves as a secondary tank for the lava pups. Sometimes you won't have a miner in cycle, well then you can just go in with a 4 elixir Skeleton King at the bridge and it'll not only help tank for the Lava Hound pups, but you can also use the ability to spawn a ton of skeletons. On the defensive end, this deck is also a lot more solid because not only does it have the classic miner and tombstone defensive combo, but it also has an additional ground answer in the Skeleton King, which on top of being very tanky, also deals splash damage. So overall, it's an even more well-rounded deck on defense, and comboing those ground answers with your air defenders such as your Mega Minion, your Flying Machine, and your Skeleton Dragons just really makes this such an easy and such an effective deck to play. Number 2. Royal Giant, Skeleton King. Now, the Skeleton King is really finding its way in a ton of decks in this current meta, and thus it has found its way into the Royal Giant decks. This deck is kind of a mix between some of the old Royal Giant and Giant Skeleton decks, as well as some of the current modern Royal Giant Mother Witch decks. Starting off the match, I'm generally going to be rather passive and more so reacting to my opponent's plays. So on the defensive end, of course, you have some very versatile defensive options. First off, the Mother Witch and the Skeleton Army are good at dealing with both tanks as well as swarm units. In addition, for those gigantic beatdown pushes that your opponents might be building up, you also have the Zappies to stall those tanks, as well as the Fishermen, which can pull the tanks to anywhere you want, even getting a King Tower activation, which can be very useful. Finally, you also have the synergy between the Skeleton Army as well as the Skeleton King, as for every one of those skeletons that die, the Skeleton King's ability is just going to be even more powerful. Moving on to offense, most of your offenses are just going to be off of successful counter pushes. Maybe you have some surviving units off of a defense, then just go in with a Royal Giant at the bridge in front of them. In general, I will play my Skeleton King behind the Royal Giant, but because the Skeleton King himself is a tank, it's not that big of a deal if he's in front. Nevertheless, you just want to make sure that you use his ability, get those skeletons spawning in, which will serve as additional distractions so that the opponent will not be able to deal with the Royal Giant. That is what makes this deck so deadly, so just make sure you're keeping that in mind when you go in on the offensive with this deck. That being said, if you are playing against a cheaper deck, then it may be more in your interest to play more of a beatdown style, building up a Royal Giant from the back or building up a Skeleton King from the back, and then going in with a massive push at the bridge to overwhelm your opponent's cheap defenses. Number 3. Mortar Bait. That's right, Mortar Bait is officially back and better than ever, this time with the cannon cart as well as the guards. Now this deck is slightly more aggressive than some of the decks that I've shared previously, and it also adopts a bit more of a bait style of play. Starting off the match, I'm going to cycle a little bit more aggressively. I'm generally okay with cycling a miner, my spear goblins, a mortar, or a log, some of which will force out a response from my opponents, and then I'll just begin to react from there. On the defensive end, you have a ton of different options. First off, to pull any sort of major tanks that the opponent might have, you of course have a defensive mortar as well as a cannon cart, because when the cannon cart dies, it spawns a cannon that will distract the opponent's tanks. In addition to that, you have a plethora of bait units, from the guards to the spear goblins to the minion horde, which are all super effective if the opponent does not have the small spell to deal with them. And finally, of course, you have the miner, which is just kind of your catch-all that you'll use as a last-minute defensive option. Moving on to the offense, this deck is a little bit more fluid because it has the Mortar as well as some cheap pressure cards, meaning that you can actually play defense with offense. If the opponent has a push coming your way, maybe cycle in a quick little minor Spear Goblins push in the opposite lane and really force your opponents to spend some elixir in that department. This is especially effective if you know that your opponents do not have their small spells in cycle. Alternatively, the Cannon card is an insanely effective pressure card that is very, very good if you have a surviving Cannon card in a counter push. That being said, however, one of the best parts is that the offense is so flexible. You can either play it like a Mortar cycle deck, or you can play it like a classic Mortar Bait deck, or you can mix it for a little bit of both. This deck is very, very versatile, and once you get the hang of it, is going to be very, very deadly. Number 4, Royal Hogs Cycle. Now this deck might look a little bit hard to play. You barely have any defensive options, you just have an Archer Queen as air defense. I mean, how are you supposed to play this deck? And I'll admit, this is a difficult deck to pick up and play. But if you do manage to get that playstyle down, it is very, very deadly. Starting off, this is a cycle deck, meaning that the ways you're going to get damage onto the opponent's tower is going to be slowly but surely chipping damage away from the opponent's tower. May that be a couple Royal Hog hits or some spell damage from your Earthquakes and your Logs. Therefore, starting out the match, I'm always going to be aggressively cycling some of my cycle cards, getting chip damage onto my opponent's tower, and most likely splitting my Royal Hogs in the center of the arena. The offense of this deck is going to be pretty straightforward. I mean, you really only have your Royal Hogs and your Earthquakes, and because those are pretty much just guaranteed damage onto the opponent's tower, the more Royal Hogs and the more Earthquakes you're able to cycle, the more guaranteed damage you're going to be getting on your opponent's tower. And so your whole goal is just to be cycling as many of those cards as possible. The defensive end of this deck, though, is where things are going to get a little bit more sketchy. Starting off, your first line of defense is always going to be offense. If your opponent goes in with a big tank in the back, pressure the opposite lane with your Royal Hogs. This is going to be your one chance at getting a big chunk of damage, as well as force out a response from your opponent so that they can't support their own pushes. Secondly, you're going to want to utilize your Archer Queen as best as possible. If the opponent doesn't have a lightning spell, then this shouldn't be that big of an issue, but if the opponents do have a lightning spell, well then you're going to have to pay extra attention to not give your opponents lightning value, especially to hit that cannon, because the cannon is going to be the second half of this deck's defense. It actually deals a decent amount of damage, and being so cheap, it'll actually allow you to occasionally cycle back to a second Archer Queen, and combining that with the Royal Delivery as sort of your mini tank makes for a surprisingly effective defensive arsenal. Last but not least, because the Earthquake deals so much damage, it is worth your while in overtime to really start playing those Earthquakes onto the opponent's tower, just so that you can win that overtime victory. Number 5, Electro Giant Beatdown. Now this is kind of the modern variation of Electro Giant Beatdown, featuring the somewhat recently released Golden Knight. Now being a beatdown deck, the playstyle is going to be relatively more straightforward, so it's a much easier deck in my opinion for people to pick up and play. Starting off the match, I'm always going to be playing very, very passively, cycling some of my cheap cards, going in with a Tombstone, but if the opponent plays a big commitment in the back, or especially if the opponent wastes one of their building cards, then 100% go in with an Electro Giant in the back and immediately begin building up your offensive pushes. Now, the offense of Electro Giant decks is relatively simple. Your main goal is to get that Electro Giant to the Crown Tower, because if that Electro Giant can get there, it's pretty much just going to be towered down, let's be honest here. Therefore, the entire goal of your offense is to just support that Electro Giant. Generally, the push I find that works is a combination of a single Electro Giant, a single support troop, as well as a single spell. This is because an Electro Giant is, after all, a really, really expensive card. So oftentimes, if you just go all in supporting the Electro Giant with troops, you sometimes will find that you're just going to be lacking the elixir to apply any of those spells. Nevertheless, the offense of this deck is relatively simple. A lot of great synergies with the Tornado as well as the Lightning, which just make it very, very easy to formulate an effective offense. And moving on to the defense of this deck, it's just as equally solid. First off, you have the Tombstone, which is an amazing distraction unit for any single target hitting units. Then you have the Golden Knight, which is not only good with swarms, but with the dash ability can take care of the opponent's supporting units. And then lastly, you have the Baby Dragon and the Bomber, which combined with the Tornado can form an extremely effective defensive barrier that the opponents just can't stop. All in all, a very simple and easy to pick up deck to play, as long as your main focus is just getting that Electro Giant to the opponent's tower.